Every time I think I'll wrap it up on the UN speeches, I come across more. The General Assembly has concluded now, but that source I mentioned, DRM, I don't honestly know much about it, so who knows? Further down the line, I might see it's funded by a particular government, and I'll think, yeah, that's a dubious source. But as it stands, it is a good platform for seeing lots of speeches you wouldn't necessarily see elsewhere. So for that reason alone, it's useful. I've just watched a speech by the Danish, I think she was the foreign minister, and she was spot on regarding the situation in Gaza. It's clearly no longer about self defence. And she reiterated that Copenhagen, like numerous other Western countries, has routinely condemned what happened on October the 7th and routinely condemned the treatment of the hostages. But this has gone well beyond any reasonable self defence. I've just watched a bit of a debate with Mike Waltz, the American ambassador to the UN, and our ambassador, Barbara Woodward, Dame Barbara Woodward. And I honestly find it reassuring that we are not blindly going along with Washington on every issue, and this is one clear difference. Um, I'm going to say right now, when it comes to Gaza and that conflict, that genocide, but yes, the wider conflict, I think the United States has no credibility under Donald Trump. Why? Because when you have a third party, a very powerful third party, that is so absolutely, utterly biased to one side, how can there be a credible broker? Now, previous American presidents have made real efforts in that region. I think of Bill Clinton and the Oslo Accords in 1995, which, of course, Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat also deserve credit for. I think of the late Jimmy Carter and the Camp David Accord between Israel and Egypt in 1979, between Begin and Sadat specifically. But what Donald Trump has done has come in as an ultra right winger, and absolutely clear that he is entirely biased towards Israel. The most of the Trump administration has done is criticised Israel's attack on Qatar, because Qatar is also pro-West, so the Trump administration kind of had to do that. Of course, the Trump administration bought this jet from Qatar, so that is a slightly murky thing going on. It's I wonder how that ties into ties with Israel, but regardless, I heard part of Mike Waltz's speech, and I just thought, frankly, it doesn't even matter if he condemns some of Israel's excesses, because his boss, Donald Trump, has made it clear that the American policy is to absolutely 100% back Israel. Marco Rubio visited the Wailing Wall. Donald Trump made a sick joke about turning Gaza into real estate. So I just don't think the Americans have any credibility on this. It's going to isolate them further on the world stage, not just Israel, also the United States. But it's also going to make it more despised in the region. Now, I'm not naive. I know my country. I know the United Kingdom also has a very controversial historic role in that part of the world. There are many Arab people, and indeed many Palestinians, who think of the UK and their first thought is anger. Their first thing to say. I watched a documentary earlier this year on the origins of this conflict, and it was recorded a few years back, so before the current violence. But the first thing that often comes up with Palestinians when they talk to British journalists is Balfour. Even if they've got limited English, it's Balfour, the Balfour Declaration. This refers to our former Prime Minister, who was then Foreign Secretary and helped to draft in the framework that created the State of Israel. But, so there's always going to be some Arabs and some Palestinians who don't trust the United Kingdom. But does that mean that we are wrong to recognise Palestine? Does it mean that we're wrong to criticise Israel now? I don't think so, because I think over time that resentment against the UK will diminish, and the focus will be more on America's support for Israel. There will still, there's always going to be some people that don't trust this country. But I hope they recognise that we have done something which is in keeping with the rest of the international community, or the vast majority of it, in recognising Palestine. And I hope they are fair in the assessments and look to the fact that the United Kingdom has clearly criticised Israel. We've criticised the settlement expansion, we've criticised settler violence, we've criticised Israel's targeting of hospitals, despite its claims it clearly does do that. I mean, so far, certainly under the Sunak administration and up until that point, really, the attitude was, to sort of ask Israel to show restraint. And it was always to give Israel the benefit of the doubt. So if a hospital had been hit, I remember that atrocity early on in the operation. Now, I have to say it's still not 100% sure which side done that, but up to 400 people killed. But, it was immediately just believing Israel's narrative that it must have come from Hamas. And maybe it did. But there's no question about it that a lot of the actions since then have absolutely been the culpability of the Israeli military. I don't really buy this argument that, well, we give them a warning so that takes away our culpability, which is Israel's line. Or when they slaughter journalists or when they slaughter aid workers, it's a mistake. Every single time. And the United States attitude every single time is to believe them. And for a long time that was the British attitude. So I'm pleased we're no longer taking that line. We're no longer just accepting everything Israel says. I have to say this is one area of foreign policy. I think the Starmer administration is now doing the right thing. It's true that Starmer, like so many issues, was cautious on this, and he attracted anger from the left early on when he said that Israel has a right to cut off electricity. That didn't go down well. The problem with Keir Starmer's delivery on so many issues is it seems contradictory and like he's been pushed into it rather than speaking with conviction. And yeah, I don't think Starmer's stupid, I really don't. But coming to the right side of this late is still better than not at all. And I'm not, by the way, saying it's black and white where now the Palestinians are completely right and the Israelis are completely wrong. That would be foolish. Hamas is a brutal terrorist organisation, and the way they've treated those hostages is appalling. The way they've sexually degraded female hostages, the way they've kept them in horrendous conditions. Although it has to be said, Israel's brutal military campaign is not going to help the hostages. That's just a no-brainer. Right now, Israel is largely isolated in the world. That's the truth. The United States absolutely supports it. And of course you will get pockets of support around the world. You'll get it in some parts of South America. You'll get it in India. You'll get it in some parts of Europe. And certainly amongst the right in the UK, there's still quite strong support for Israel. But the vast majority of the world now recognises Palestine. The vast majority of the world, not just Islamic countries, across the world, have criticised Israel's excess as a collective punishment of Palestinian civilians. I think the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, is absolutely right to say that. Israel has tried to smear him as a Hamas supporter, even though he has repeatedly condemned Hamas, because this is one strategy the Netanyahu government uses. Whenever they're criticised, they say that the criticism must come from Hamas supporters. It's perfectly compatible to recognise what Israel is doing is totally immoral whilst also condemning Hamas. I don't think it's a case of backing one or the other. But it is clear that Israel has went to a whole other level. And I'm pleased that my country is on the side of the international community with this. The fact of the matter is, if Donald Trump really wants a Nobel Peace Prize, he could end this tomorrow. He really could. He could threaten Israel and say, look, this has gone on too long. Too many civilians are suffering. You either change course or we are cutting off aid tomorrow. But Donald Trump won't do that. And you could say it's because of the Israel lobby in the United States. I think it's because Netanyahu's a right-winger, Trump's a right-winger. There's an ideological thing there. It's an absolutely repugnant situation. And I saw an op-ed in the Eye recently, and it hit the mark. I can't remember off the top of my head who wrote it, if I'm being honest, but it basically said that there is an implicit notion from those who routinely defend Israel that Palestinian lives are worth less. That Palestinian civilian is inherently worth less than an Israeli civilian. It just, I don't think anyone can deny that. That is the attitude of the Americans. Despite what they claim, their hollow words about caring about the Palestinian people, they don't, especially not this administration. How can they, when they are by far, the biggest backer of Israel, by far? Now, you could argue that the UK still sends weapons to Israel, and that is true, and I think we should cut it off. But it is minuscule compared to what's given by the United States. And unlike the United States, we are actually condemning what Israel is doing. It's kind of a thankless position for Starmer, because the left wing of his party says, hey, it's too little, too late. And then you'll have the right in this country who are part of that minority in the world that blindly back Israel. I would challenge Kimi Badenoch and all those other Tories whose knee-jerk attitude is just to defend Israel and to regurgitate this narrative that recognising Palestine rewards Hamas. I appreciate some of the families of the hostages might think that, but they are implicitly against a two-state solution. As the Prime Minister said, that is not what Hamas wants. They want the total destruction of Israel. They don't want the Jewish state to exist at all. Which is why this government is rightly against Hamas. But they don't want a two-state solution. So yes, they're cheering, but I think that's more just to do with the fact that they see Israel's former allies criticising it, rather than actually a recognition that there's any alignment with their views, because there isn't. I do think the way the government's handled it in this country could be better, because prescribing Palestine Action as a terrorist organisation, whilst the Iranian Revolutionary Guard isn't, is strange. Palestine Action does definitely have some unsavoury elements, and absolutely they have engaged in criminal vandalism. I've said before, I don't think sabotage of an RAF site is trivial, but I don't know how you can treat people simply holding up a placard as a dangerous terrorist. This does absolutely nothing to help the fears and the concerns in this country that freedom of speech is under assault. Ironically, a lot of the right-wingers who are pushing that narrative, many of them Reform supporters, they talk about free speech and they talk about Lucy Connolly. If they really care about free speech, will they also denounce the arresting of peaceful Palestinian Action demonstrators? We're not talking here about people blocking roads like Just Stop Oil or those more hardcore elements. We're talking about people who are simply holding up placards in Trafalgar Square. So the government's contradicting itself by, on one hand, criticising Israel and recognising Palestine, yet punishing people quite harshly simply for holding up a placard. I think when it comes to the free speech issue, Starmer has really, really handled it badly. He just does not make the connection with his actions, his government's actions, and the concerns that people have. So domestically, that's, it's a serious Achilles heel that Labour has. And like I say before, they didn't introduce those laws, but they're doing nothing to... Well, they did introduce the one on Palestine Action, actually. But my question for those right-wingers, whose knee-jerk attitude is always to talk about October the 7th and to defend Israel, if we consider 66,000 people have been killed in Gaza, it's estimated 2/3 of which are civilians. We could deduce that over 40,000 civilians have been killed. And even if you want to say Hamas-run figures cannot be trusted, you cannot seriously look at those images with the massive destruction that's been caused and say with a straight face that there's no civilian suffering. You cannot tell me with a straight face that Palestinian children and women have been killed and non-combatant men. That you cannot tell me that, because it's a lie and it just defies common sense. I really have a problem with these right-wingers who just have such callous disregard for Palestinian civilian suffering. Or they'll go down the line of saying, yes, it's awful, but it's entirely the fault of Hamas. Well, Hamas is responsible for their insanely stupid decision to attack Israel on October the 7th and for the atrocities they're responsible for. But I do hold Israel responsible for its own actions. I do hold Israel responsible for settler violence. I do hold Israel responsible for its genocidal campaign in Gaza. And this idea of absolutely eliminating Gaza from the face of the earth. It's absolutely genocidal. And this is a horrendous situation because For all Israel claims that they give people notice of for leaving, where the hell are they supposed to go? I mean, this is barbaric. It really is. And the American position, you know, we have the world's most powerful country backing Israel. It's shameful. It really is. Anyway, I'm going to wrap this up, but I would just say to those people, how do you justify the collective punishment of Palestinian civilians? How can you say that Israel's doing everything it can to mitigate civilian casualties? Spare me that lie. Stop it. Stop defending this. And you cannot say that everyone around the world who's backing the Palestinians now, who's recognising Palestine, is a Hamas cheerleader. European countries especially have explicitly condemned Hamas, explicitly called for the release of hostages, and many of them have put sanctions on Hamas. So that just doesn't add up. It's true that in other parts of the world there is a blind eye to what Hamas is doing to civilians, and that's wrong. You know, so the other countries criticising Israel should recognise that Hamas has also targeted civilians. But the scale is just so much bigger in Gaza. It is. I mean, 1,200 people died on that terrible day, but we've had tens of thousands of Palestinians killed, slaughtered in their beds, entire families wiped out. What little they have destroyed. You know, aid being deliberately cut off. Israel can claim it's allowing aid in. It's also blocking a lot of aid. The food drops that have been sent into Gaza, some of them have actually killed people because people are so desperate that they've either drowned or been crushed by the food drops. It's absolute hell on earth, and it has to be one of the worst places in the world right now. There's a few places that can claim that title. I would say Haiti is pretty grim, Sudan, eastern Ukraine. But yeah, the rate of killing in Gaza is just horrendous. Every single day, dozens of civilians killed. So I think I think Dame Barbara Woodward made a good speech. I'm going to put a link to it here. But for all those right-wingers whose knee-jerk attitude is just to defend Israel, do you seriously think that the entire international community is naive? That the entire international community, most of it, I should say, are Hamas cheerleaders? No. They simply see that what is happening is repugnant. Now, there is hypocrisy, of course there is, around the world. The Iranian regime has killed its own people. The Chinese regime has sent Uyghur people to concentration camps. Russia is sure as hell in no position to criticise Israel. So there may be an argument that Israel's unfairly being singled out. But in of itself, Israel deserves all the criticism it gets. Some of those other countries are far from squeaky clean when it comes to killing civilians, and they should also be called out. So I do agree that Israel shouldn't be the only one that's called out. I mean, there was a mass walkout when Netanyahu spoke. I hope I think there should have been a mass walkout from Europeans when the Russian delegation speaks. But we're in a very chaotic world right now, and my position is simple when it comes to these things. The killing of civilians in war is wrong. Period. I don't care what side is doing it. That is just that's just not something that can ever be condoned. The deliberate targeting of civilians, and what Israel is doing in Gaza, despite all its claims, is absolutely the collective punishment of the Palestinian people. It's repugnant. It's repugnant. Netanyahu can lash out as much as he wants. He can gaslight people and call them anti-Semites and all the rest of it, ignoring the fact that many Israelis have protested against what's going on. That's the thing. It's Israelis themselves and Jewish groups who are opposing the Netanyahu government. So it really is isolated. The only people who support it are hardline Israelis, the United States, current government, many Americans don't, and some right-wing factions in countries like India and elsewhere. But the vast majority of the international consensus right now is critical of what Israel is doing. I'm pleased that my country is now on the side of the majority. Again, I know there'll be people in that part of the world will always blame us over the Balfour Declaration and say Britain's hypocritical, etc. But at least they can't say Britain cannot be accused of not criticising Israel, because we have. And I think the Starmer government is right to take that position. So that's my thoughts. I'll put a link to the video. But shame on the United States, shame on Mike Waltz, shame on Donald Trump, shame on their support for Israel, because this is an abomination. And it makes an absolute mockery of America claiming to be a peacemaker.